Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. Every touch is a step forward. By Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom. By Tandem Diabetes Care, makers of the t:slim X2 insulin pump. And by Real Good Foods, real food you feel good about eating.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Welcome to a bonus episode of Diabetes Connections. I'm your host, Stacey Sims. Glad to have you along for this different kind of show. We're doing these once a month, calling them Diabetes Connections Extras, where we do a deep dive. The whole show is about one issue of diabetes management. This month, we are focusing on getting the best use out of your CGM, whatever brand continuous glucose monitor you use. As usual, these extra episodes start out as a shorter interview during the regularly scheduled episode that ran just a couple of days ago. But this is the whole shebang, the whole interview, usually 30 minutes longer than the excerpt. And I'm really excited to talk to our guest this week because not only is Gary Scheiner incredibly qualified to do this, I mean, he is an award-winning certified diabetes educator. He was the 2014 Diabetes Educator of the Year, named so by the American Association of Diabetes Educators. He is the author of 6 books, including Think Like A Pancreas. And as you'll hear, he's got an update coming out to that book. He updates it every so often as things change. And not only does he train people on insulin pumps and CGMs, he has worn just about every system that there is. So having type 1, having that personal experience, being an educator, working with people, I think gives him a really unique perspective that, we can all appreciate and we can really learn from. Again, we're talking about every kind of CGM available in the United States. We are a U.S.-centric show, so there may be others available around the world in different countries, and there are more, I'm sure, in the works, in the pipeline, coming out. So this is for this moment of time of May 2019, best use of the CGMs that are available in the U.S. market. So here's my talk with CDE and the founder of Integrative Diabetes Services, Gary Scheiner. Gary, thank you so much for talking to me about this. When I wanted to talk CGM, I thought, who do I know who's worn just about every single one of them, who has patients who've worn every single one of them, and really has this expertise. So thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure, Stacey. I'm a human guinea pig.
Well, I think when you're talking about these different types of diabetes technologies, if you haven't worn it or experienced it, it's really difficult to understand it. My son's used to Dexcom since 2013, and I can't say I understand it as well as he has, certainly, but it's hard to explain to people who don't wear them. So let's just jump right in and kind of set the parameters here. I don't want to do a comparison of what's best, because it's very individual, unless you want to jump on in and give us the skinny on the A+ CGM.
I mean, the systems each have their share of pros and cons. I would say, from an accuracy standpoint, the implantable sensor is probably has the best accuracy, but it has to be surgically implanted and it has to be calibrated a couple of times a day. But the Dexcom G6 is very close in terms of accuracy with, no calibrations at all, followed by, the Libre and the Medtronic. I'm still waiting for Medtronic to launch a really state-of-the-art effective sensor. Hopefully the next generation systems will prove better than the ones they've had in the past.
Well, I'll refer people to several articles you've written, and we'll link those up, comparing them kind of side by side. But I'd really like to focus on whatever you use, and maybe we'll go through them type by type, but whatever you use, how to get the most out of it, some tips and tricks so that people can really get the best out of the devices that they're using. Why don't we start with Medtronic? Because, and I don't use that system, I'm not as familiar with it, but take us through what's there because they have a standalone CGM, but my understanding, could be wrong, my understanding is that for the most part, people use it with a pump.
Yeah, most people who are using the Medtronic sensor, and I would say 99.9% using Medtronic sensors are using it with the 670 or 630G pumps that have the kind of the hybrid closed loop technologies. So the pump will make some decisions on its own regarding the insulin delivery based on the information that the sensor is feeding into it. If there's anybody who wants to get better diabetes control and better quality of life out of the sensor, I think the same principles apply no matter what system they're using. I mean, there's a few subtle differences regarding, calibration and how the sensor's inserted, et cetera. But there's some basic things. And I'll start out with, well, first off, the three things that CGMs can give us in real time are numbers, trending information, and high-low alerts. So I think it's worth discussing those one at a time, starting with the numbers themselves. And it's interesting, going back a decade or so, we just didn't trust the numbers on CGM the way we do now. In fact, just a couple of years ago, the T1D Exchange did a survey of CGM users and asked them how many of them are using the CGM numbers for determining their insulin doses. And this was long before the FDA approved the systems as a replacement for fingersticks. But even years ago, more than 80% of people were using the CGM for dosing.
Wow.
I think the key is that you're smart about it and know when it's reliable for dosing and when it's not. And there are a lot of scenarios or situations where the CGM is not going to provide you with a reliable data point for determining an insulin dose. And I'll ask you, Stacey, since you have some experience using them with your son, can you think of a situation where you're going to need to resort to a fingerstick?
Oh, sure. The first one that comes to mind is during a rapid drop. If it's showing me something like that after exercise, perhaps, or just kind of out of the blue, but if it's going very quickly.
Absolutely. And that's attributable to the lag time. When you have a 5 to 10 minute lag time and the blood sugar is changing very rapidly, your sensor, if it's rising, your sensor is going to underestimate your blood sugar almost all the time. And when it's falling, it's going to overestimate your blood sugar almost all the time. So if there are straight up, straight down, or double up, double down arrows on screen, it's preferential to do a fingerstick to get a more precise number for dosing purposes. Think of any other situations?
I would say, it's funny because switching to the G6, Gary, I don't know if I should tell you this, but we don't fingerstick much at all. So I would say in our previous CGM life, my answer would have been after eating, immediately after eating for an hour or two with Benny for sure.
With the G6 or with any CGM that doesn't require calibration, are there times when it does not give you data?
Sure, when he'll lose signal, or with the share, when I'll lose signal. But there are times when he's swimming, right? He's in the water, or he's in the shower, or he's laying on the sensor in a funky way, and you don't get those numbers.
And I would add to that warm-up periods, which the warm-up periods are a couple of hours with most systems. With the Eversense, it's a 12-hour warm-up. But during warm-up periods, you're still going to need to fingerstick to have any data. And most people find that on day one of a sensor, the accuracy is generally not as good as it's going to get. G6 is not too bad. The day one accuracy with G6 is decent. With every other sensor, the day one accuracy lags far behind what they're going to get on day two and beyond. So it's generally a good idea to fingerstick on day one, at least the first day you have a sensor on, just to make sure things are dosed correctly. Acetaminophen is another thing that affects some systems, not all. The Medtronic, the Dexcom G4, G5, those systems are affected by any kind of Tylenol products. It's amazing how many over-the-counter cough and cold medicines contain acetaminophen.
Oh, yeah.
And if you take that acetaminophen, your glucose is going to run higher. It's going to appear higher than it really is on the sensor for a while. So that's another time that fingersticks will be necessary.
You mentioned Medtronic and acetaminophen. I just want to make sure that doesn't go by too quickly because I had not heard that. I thought it was only Dexcom.
No, Medtronic sensors as well. If your son has a low blood sugar, after he's treated it, does the CGM show that his glucose comes up right away?
It does not. It does not.
There.
Yeah.
That's the case with every CGM.
Yeah.
There is an extended lag time when we recover from low blood sugar. So if we trust the sensor and it keeps reading low, 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 you're just going to eat, and wind up over-treating. And we don't need any help over-treating our lows. We're hungry enough to do that ourselves.
So perfect example of that perfect storm was just yesterday. Benny had a sensor change. So we had 2 hours of no blood sugar numbers. And about 20 minutes before the warm-up ended, he said, I feel low. I said, well, we've only got 20 minutes. He said, no, I feel low. I'm going to check. And he checked and he was 70. And he said, I feel lower than that. I'm going to treat. And he treated, and as soon as the warm-up period ended, of course, it started screaming at us that he was low. 5 minutes later, we did another finger stick. He was already 84 or 85 and coming up.
Yeah.
But the Dexcom share kept screaming low. And it's not just in my house. My mom gets those alerts. So I had to text Grandma and say, it's fine. Dexcom is bananas. It'll catch up. Don't worry. It was a long low. Gary had like 20 carbs, I think, of juice. And it took him about an hour to float up to 120. And then he went to bed and he was like 90 all night. So it was a crazy low.
Be careful how you phrase it. It took him probably 15 minutes to come up to 120. It took the Dexcom to recognize the rise.
Proving your point.
What happened. Yeah. The Dexcom will sometimes take 30 to 60 minutes to capture the rise in blood sugar. And the reason is basically that the sensor is sitting just below the skin. It's not measuring the blood vessels or the bloodstream directly. And it takes quite a while for blood flow to be restored to the skin surface when a low blood sugar occurs. Our bodies go into a stress response with a low, and there's very little blood flow getting to the skin surface, and hence the sensor's not catching the fact that there's more glucose in the bloodstream. So it's necessary to do finger sticks when you're recovering from a low to prevent overtreatment. Also, anytime symptoms don't match, like what's happening with your son, if the sensor is saying you're high and you don't feel high, or it says you're low and you don't feel low, it's best to finger stick and verify what's going on. So it's still, finger sticks are still part of the game, even with a non-calibrating system like a Dexcom or a Libre. And as far as calibration goes, another thing that's important to make sure the system operates properly is that if you do finger stick and see a discrepancy of more than 20%, it is a good idea to finger stick. Calibrate. Enter that reading as a calibration. Otherwise, the CGM is going to continue to underperform. If it's drifted out of range and is running higher or lower than the actual glucose, if you don't calibrate it, it's never going to get back on track. So it is necessary to calibrate when it's not running accurately.
Can you tell us how to calibrate accurately? Because I think there is some confusion there, too.
Yeah, well, it's very important to use a meter that's accurate. I'm a fan of the Contour Next meter. I feel that's the most accurate one on the market. Make sure your finger's clean when you check and you enter the reading right away. You can calibrate the Dexcom just by going into settings and entering a calibration. That's pretty simple to do. I think a downside to the Libre is that it cannot be calibrated. So if it's not performing properly, if it's running higher or lower than your actual blood sugar, there's no way to fix it. At least with Dexcom, with the G6, you can enter a calibration. But as I said, it's not necessary to enter calibrations unless you have a reading that's more than 20% off from what the sensor is showing. Second thing would be the high and low alerts. This, to me, is the major selling point of CGM and is still extremely important for anybody who takes insulin who's at risk of hypoglycemia. Most people with diabetes do a pretty poor job of guessing what their blood sugar is, and most people don't recognize their lows or their highs until they get to a fairly extreme state. For example, I can't tell when my blood sugar is low until it gets down close to 50. And there are people who can't even tell in the 50s when they're low. And hardly anybody can tell when their glucose is just a little bit high. If you're 180, it doesn't feel any different than 80 does. So the CGM is very good at picking up on those subtle highs or subtle lows so that you can treat them before they become extreme. So the critical aspects of this, number one, is putting the settings in properly, and number two, responding properly. So I'll talk about the settings first. Because of the lag time, it's not reasonable to put the low alert at 70. If the sensor thinks you've gone below 70 and your blood sugar is falling, you're probably around 50 already. So it's necessary to put the low alert for most people somewhere between 80 and 90, and just to be able to catch it while it's still treatable and you may still be able to prevent the low. At the high end, I take a little different approach. I think it's fine to start with a very high setting. Put it at 300 if you want. I don't want people getting too many nuisance alarms when they start using the system, but eventually pare that high alert down to a point where you're catching it at your highest allowable post-meal blood sugar. So if you don't want to go above, say, 200 after meals, that would be a reasonable place to put your high alert eventually. And then the next aspect of it is response to the alerts. It's sort of like that tree falls in the forest and no one hears it thing. What's the difference? It's the same thing with these alerts. If you get a high or low alert and don't react to it, it's meaningless. And what I have to teach people is that when they get these alerts, they can't think. They have to just act. With any high alert, it's a good idea to enter that reading into your pump and bolus if the pump says to. If you're on injections, calculate a correction dose, but also figure out how much insulin on board you have and deduct that. But for any high alert, give yourself extra insulin if needed. It's also, worthwhile to drink some water, maybe get a little bit of physical activity. And with a low alert, it's very simple. You have to take rapid-acting carbs to reverse that downward trend and get your blood sugar back up. If you do that quickly and consistently, I guarantee you'll spend a lot more time within your target blood sugar zone.
There are those times where you hit that high mark if it's set at 200, and I do have a teenage son, so this might be different for other people. He'll give himself some insulin, and then half an hour later, that alarm goes off again. You want to be careful, obviously, about stacking and over-delivering of insulin. But, is it a question that if you're always hitting that to maybe rethink your timing of the first dose of insulin or, simple things like that? I mean, it can really give you an idea of what the heck is going on if you're always hitting that high.
Oh, of course, it's always better to prevent the high. Looking back at some of your data and patterns is helpful. But, anytime a high reading does occur, respond appropriately. You hit on a very important point, which is to avoid the stacking. And then that means deducting your insulin on board or your active insulin from whatever dose you feel you need. People who keep dosing over and over again to try to fix it, we call that angry bolusing or rage bolusing. Right. And that almost always leads to serious hypoglycemia. So, correct the highs, but do it intelligently. Consider what's still in your system.
And we mentioned the lows being a bit of a lag for, especially with Dexcom and CGMs. Is it the same thing with a high, or do the systems seem to react more quickly to let's say your alarm is at 200. Does it seem to reflect that more quickly, or is it another question of blood flow and reflecting the numbers?
Yeah, it should capture, if your glucose is high and you give insulin to reverse it, it should pick that up relatively quickly. The only problem when you're low is your body isn't delivering much blood flow to the skin surface. That doesn't happen when your sugar's high, though. And then the third element of your daily data are the trending arrows, the up and down arrows that you see on screen. So take an example with your son. If he's going into dinner with a blood sugar of 150 and he's going to eat 60 grams of carb, you can calculate the dose he needs for that. But what if you knew that his blood sugar was 150 and falling quickly? Would that change the dose that he's likely to need?
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely. And the same thing, if he's rising quickly, it's going to change the dose that's needed. And, the trend arrows allow us to make better decisions. And we probably make an average of 40 decisions a day about things related to our blood sugar. Everything from our insulin doses to what we eat, when we eat, physical activity, etc. Just to make our lives better and safer, to help us make better decisions, we should be looking for those trend arrows pretty often. I teach my patients that for every upward arrow, if their glucose is rising, let's say 1 to 2 points per minute, they should probably dose for an extra 25 to 30 points on their blood sugar. So assume their glucose is 25 to 30 points higher than it actually is and dose for that. And with double up arrows, they should figure they're about 50 to 60 points higher than they actually are and dose for that. And with down arrows, they should assume their glucose is actually lower than it is. If they're dropping 1 to 2 points per minute, knock off 25 to 30 points from the actual glucose that they have. And with double down arrows, knock off 50 to 60 points when determining the dose to give. That improves the chances you'll be on target the next time you check.
Are the arrow speeds and those calculations consistent brand to brand? In other words, okay.
They're not. And that is such a frustrating thing. I just finished writing my next edition of Think Like a Pancreas, and I put a section in there on how to make adjustments for trend arrows. And I had to do the research on how, the exact nomenclature for every system. And it is different for every CGM on the market. Some have diagonal arrows, some have single up and down, some have double, some have triple, and they all mean different things. So you have to consider how your system interprets those arrows. That's why I say a 1 to 2 point rise, a 2 to 3 point rise, etc., rather than just saying 1 arrow, 2 arrows. If it's a Dexcom, which is probably the most popular and commonly used, I would treat each arrow as 25 points. So if you have a diagonal up arrow, add 25. If you have a straight up arrow, add 50. If you have a double up arrows, add 75 to your current glucose. And if they're down arrows, deduct 25 or 50 or 75. But that only applies to Dexcom.
I was going to say,
using something else, you gotta look at the manual.
That's what I was just going to say. Maybe get out the manual, get out the book for the different brands. But it's frustrating that there's no industry standard in terms of arrows and speed. That would be helpful.
Yeah. The Endocrine Society did come out with a paper that gave some general recommendations about the arrows, but it wasn't specific, based on which system and which arrows were showing up. But when my book comes, it'll be out probably third quarter of this year. I've got much more detailed recommendations on how much to adjust based on those. So the trending arrows, there's such a help if you're about to go to sleep, if you're about to drive or exercise or whatever you're doing. Knowing what direction your glucose is headed lets you make a better, more effective decision about how to manage your diabetes through that activity. So looking at those trend arrows is very important. So once you get past your real-time data, then you can start to look at downloaded reports. With Dexcom, we have the Clarity program that can generate reports. Medtronic has CareLink. Freestyle Libre has their own PC-based software called LibreView. Eversense has an app that's on the phone that can generate reports. But I'm a fan of something called spaghetti reports. These are reports that superimpose multiple days of data on the same graph. And that way you can kind of evaluate where you tend to experience most of your highs and lows. You can evaluate what happens before your lows and what happens after to try to troubleshoot. You can see how high your post-meal peaks are, what kind of quote-unquote spikes you're experiencing after various meal times. You can see if the basal insulin you're taking, whether it's by a pump or injection, you can see if it's holding you steady when it's supposed to be. Overnight and mainly before meals, it should be keeping you fairly level. So there's a lot you can learn from looking at your CGM data to help with your own fine-tuning process and also for sharing with your healthcare providers.
That spaghetti layout I remember from Dexcom Studio software from several years ago. Is it in Clarity?
Yes.
You can tell that I do a deep dive into Clarity all the time. So I usually look at the big picture and then talk to our endo about it. I'll tell you, it's hard to not be a really math person when you're a diabetes parent. It just doesn't compute. Oh.
Yeah, the big picture report is also called an ambulatory glucose profile. That's the one that kind of summarizes for you and shows, for each phase of the day, what percentage of your time is in range or high or low. And you can learn some things from that, but you can learn a lot more from the spaghetti graphs because you can dive into more of the details.
Sure.
So unless you're on a very fixed schedule, the summary graphs are going to can be very misleading. The spaghetti graphs will reveal a lot more important information than the summary graphs will. And I also like to look at some of the stats. The average glucose on the sensor for the last month should correlate very closely with your A1C. So if anybody who has a doctor who does the A1C at the office can actually go in and say, hey, doc, I'll bet you double or nothing on my copay. I can guess my A1C within 0.2. And I'll give you the magic formula for doing that. You can share with your listeners. If you take the average for 30 days on your CGM and add 3% to it, so you multiply by 1.03, that'll give you a truer average because all CGM systems do underestimate glucose a little bit. Now, to that true average, you add 46.7 and then divide by 28.7, and that will give you a free copay.
All right, wait. I have to ask you, though, How did you come up with those numbers?
I didn't come up with them. That's called an estimated average glucose equation. That was derived from some people much smarter than me. The 3% is my own fudge factor. I've just observed that over many years that the CGM average tends to underestimate slightly. That's why I have people add about 3% to their average to get a true average.
All right, folks, we'll write that out. I'll put that formula in the show notes so you can cut and paste it. That's pretty funny,
Yeah.
Gary. I love it.
The A1C and the average are their quantity measures. Most of us now are more interested in the time in range. Now, that's a much more valuable metric. It really reflects the quality of our control. And if you're achieving, let's say, 75% or more of time in range, that's phenomenal. That's really nice control for most people. If your time in range is under 50%, you got some work to do. Most people are in the 50, 60% range, but getting it up above 75% is highly desirable.
Let me ask you some hardware type questions. One of the things that I've seen passed around a lot lately is insertion technique. I'll be honest with you. My son, who's 14, he grabs the G6, he slaps it on his arm, he pushes the button, he's done. Are there actual insertion techniques with different CGMs that will help you get better outcomes?
Well, the fewer steps that the user has to perform, the less chance for human error. And given, with the G6 and Libre, they're extremely easy to do.
That's right, same
There's
with Libre.
not a whole lot that we can muck up. So it's the kind of thing that, a kid can do it. An adult who's visually impaired can do it. People with bad dexterity or a tremor can do it. The Medtronic has a lot of steps involved and a lot of things that can potentially go wrong. There's a lot of extra taping required. So, there's potential for issues with the sensor insertion. So proper training and practice is pretty important. Sensor sites are less of an issue than you might think. It's such a big deal with pumps. The infusion sites have to be managed so carefully. We don't really see too many issues with sensor sites, though. The placement is not that critical. As long as that sensor gets into a layer of fat under the skin, it should work pretty well. It doesn't matter what part of the body. It doesn't matter if there's a scar tissue or lipohypertrophy there. They still seem to work pretty well.
Is that because it's just reading and not, sending out insulin? Or is it just the wire so thin?
Yeah.
Any ideas?
Yeah, there's no chemical being infused into the body. It has to be absorbed in a certain manner. It's just measuring the glucose concentration in that tissue.
Before we move on, though, let me just ask for the Medtronic users out there, can you give them one or two pieces of advice in terms of the taping? Are there any tricks of the trade that are easy, to share?
The more stable the sensor is, the better. So I hate to say the more tape, the better, but make sure you use the over bandages to make sure that sensor is not moving around much. Another issue we often see is that if the transmitter and sensor sort of bend against each other, then the transmitter may start to lose connection periodically. So place it so that the sensor and transmitter are on a relatively flat linear surface. I know in the human body there's not a lot of flat linear surfaces. But, for example, if it's on if you have it on your arm, put it lengthwise, not sideways on the arm. Or even if it's on your abdomen, put it on a flat area, not a curved area, if at all possible.
We mentioned the G6 with Dexcom being pretty easy, one-handed, that sort of thing. But let's talk about the G5 still out there being used. It's a different inserter. It's a little bit more difficult. We used to pinch everything up and really line things up. Any advice on using that inserter? Yeah,
it's a practice makes perfect type of process. It looks a little bit intimidating, but once a person gets the hang of doing it, it becomes very simple and quick. You don't need to pinch the skin at all. The skin cleanliness is, you don't want to put it on filthy skin, but you don't have to sterilize all that carefully either. We almost never see infections at sensor sites. I guess, one thing to consider is the transmitter is going to have to be inserted after the sensor is placed. And with the G5, you have that tail assembly that has to be used. So make sure that you place the sensor in a spot where you can, easily get that transmitter snapped in. The G6 transmitter snaps in much more easily. Sure. So the actual site's not as critical. You can put it on the back of your body if you want. So yeah, the G5 and the G4 sensor insertions, and it just takes a little bit of practice. We have boxes and boxes of old G5 sensors. We give patients a chance to practice it on some fake skin when they come in. So they'll do it 3 or 4 times and really get the hang of the technique. And doing it in a one quick motion really is best. People who do it really slowly struggle a little bit, and it can hurt a little bit. When it's done in one quick motion, it's usually painless.
Yeah, I wish I had that to practice on. The first time I did it, I was on Benny, and my husband had been the one to do it, and Benny said, just do it quickly. And I did it so quickly, I almost yanked it out. I pushed it and I pulled out. He was like, stop. So, you're so nervous you're going to hurt him. But, we get the job done.
Reuse of the sensors is another thing people often want to know about. And it really depends on the sensor algorithm. With the G6, the algorithm assumes that there's going to be some change in how the sensor functions every day. There's going to be what's called drift. So by the time you get to day 8, 9, and 10, it's interpreting the signal very differently than it did on day 1, 2, and 3. So the bottom line is if you try to reuse a Dexcom G6 sensor, there's a good chance the accuracy is going to suffer. Ironically, we saw the opposite with the G5, G4 sensors. They seem to perform better on the second week because I guess there was no warm-up period and the sensor's working pretty well right from the get-go. There's still that 2-hour warm-up, but the sensor's already been housed under the skin for quite a while. So people are usually able to get a couple of weeks out of those older model sensors. But with the G6 sensors, it's probably not a good idea to be reusing them beyond the 10 days.
And let me ask you, too, anecdotally, I hear a lot, and again, I'm in a lot of mom groups, so I see the younger kids. It seems that, and you can correct me, that the younger the person and the leaner the person, the more difficulty they seem to be having with the G6 in terms of sensor failures more quickly. Are you seeing that in your practice, and is there anything that can be done?
Yeah, I haven't seen more problems with the G6 than with any other system.
Okay.
But you're right, the leaner a person is, the greater the likelihood for some sensor issues. And it's related to both hydration as well as the possibility of compression, where the sensor is pushed right up against muscle wall, or it might be partially in the muscle. So placing the sensor on a fatty area is paramount importance. With most lean kids, I recommend the buttocks for the sensors. It's not one of their quote-unquote approved sites, but it's only not approved because they didn't do a full-scale study on it used on the buttocks. But people have been using it on the buttocks for a decade or more. It works perfectly fine there. And there's usually ample fat tissue on the butt to support proper function, whereas there may not be enough fat on the abdomen or the arm where they are approved.
We haven't talked much about Eversense, which is really up and coming. And my impression was that for this episode where we're talking about best practices and things that we as individuals can do to make these CGMs better, I was thinking, well, they implant that under the skin, so there's really not much you can do with it as a user. But there are a few things. Can you touch on those?
Yeah, it's a neat product, and I must admit, I haven't used it personally. I'm scheduled to go into a clinic in Philadelphia in a couple of weeks and have mine inserted, so I will get a chance to try it firsthand. I've had a number of patients use it, though, so I've been able to kind of live vicariously through them and see how it functions. And they've all been very happy with it and pretty impressed. The insertion process, reportedly, and from the training I've received, is relatively minor. It's a pretty quick, simple thing. You barely feel anything when they place it. And once it's in the skin, that site heals up very quickly. Having it under the skin, it just eliminates issues. You don't have to worry about changing the sensor on a regular basis. Transmitter that sticks to the skin can be removed and set aside any time. So for example, if you have to go for an MRI, you don't have to take your sensor out. You just put the transmitter aside. Any kind of physical activity where it can't be worn, you can just remove it temporarily. But a nice thing about the transmitter that works with the Eversense sensor is the transmitter itself can communicate with the user by vibrating. So if there is a low or there's a high, it will vibrate with a certain tone or certain frequency to let the user know there's a potential problem. So you can go out for let's say a run without your phone or receiver, and the transmitter that's taped to your skin will let you know if there are any issues. Otherwise, there's an app in your cell phone to present your data for you. The Eversense does require a couple of calibrations per day, and the current sensor is a 3-month model. They've already approved a 6-month version in Europe, and that sensor only requires 1 calibration per day. And they're looking at versions that require far fewer calibrations than even that. And the FDA seems to take longer than most European safety commissions do. So probably within the next few years, we'll see an Eversense that requires even less work on the patient's part.
I just want to move on to a couple of specialty type questions about CGM. I'm wondering if people who are serious athletes should do things that are different in terms of either interpreting data or where they wear it. High school athletes, college athletes, people who work out and run several days a week. Is there anything different for them?
Well, the adhesion issues are pretty common with athletes, especially if they're, outdoors in the heat or just perspiring a lot with any form of exercise. Extra tape is almost always going to be needed. I know that Dexcom now offers these free over patches in packs of 10. You just have to call Dexcom and ask for them. And there's a product called Grip Grips that a lot of people use and really like. These are cloth tapes with a pre-cut hole. The adhesive it's sort of a gummy adhesive. It holds up well even when you sweat or get it wet. So that can help with the adhesion issues. Water activities can be a concern also. The water's not going to ruin the sensor or the transmitter, but the signal doesn't travel through water.
Right.
So somebody who's using a CGM may not have access to their data while they're in the water. Luckily, the transmitters will often store a certain amount of data, so as soon as you're in range of your phone or your receiver, your data will drop in. But to get live data while you're in the water is just not going to happen.
You always know when someone has gone on vacation for the first time with a CGM in our group because there's this panic of it's not working in the water, and then you realize it's not going to work in the water. But so many finger sticks at the side of the pool.
Water beds have a challenge too. They lay in a water bed, they're not going to get a signal most of the night.
Wait, for real?
Yeah. But obviously, if they put the transmitter on their abdomen and they sleep on their back, it's a problem. But if it's the other way around, if they're laying on the sensor and they have their body on top of it and a water bed under it, there's nowhere for that signal to go.
Good thing the 70s are over. Man, that could be a big problem for people. Sheesh. Let me ask you, I don't know if you can answer this, but technically speaking, there are a lot of best practices in terms of remote monitoring and even getting a signal on the user's cell phone. Can you speak to that in terms of the Bluetooth connection and making sure your phone doesn't have 20 other Bluetooth things in it, that sort of thing?
Generally, I haven't seen too many problems with people receiving data on a sharing basis. It seems to be pretty reliable and works well. I don't use the sharing data personally. I guess my wife has never asked to see my sensor data, and I don't know. I don't want to share it with her. She know everything I'm eating when I'm out. But I can obviously a parent's going to want to see their child's data, and a lot of partners do want to see especially if their partner's traveling, they like to be alerted about lows. I'd say just try not to be too much of a helicopter parent or a helicopter partner. Just get alerted if there's a problem. You don't have to be watching every little thing all throughout the day. That's overkill.
I have done many a show on remote monitoring and parents, and we'll continue to talk about that because it's such a great tool. It can give you such peace of mind if you let it, is my opinion.
Yeah, or it can drive you insane.
Right. Yeah. And I'm obviously a perfect parent, so I do it beautifully, and I never bother my son overly. Let's see. What else have we got? You mentioned a couple of minutes ago when we were talking about leaner folks, and you said dehydration, but that could be an issue for everybody using CGM, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. When someone's in a state of dehydration, they're not going to receive good blood flow to that fat layer below the skin. And when there's very poor blood flow to that layer, the sensor is not going to receive accurate glucose levels. It's not going to perform well. So in a state of dehydration, the sensor becomes very unreliable. And a second issue we see are called compression lows. And you may have seen this on your child's sensor at some point where they're going along just fine, and then all of a sudden it just drops like a stone for about 15 or 20 minutes and then pops right back up to where it was previously. That's a compression low, and that's just due to physical compression of the sensor under the skin. It can certainly happen overnight if you're lying on it or if you're sitting on it during the day or pushing up against it somehow. But that's an artifact. That's something it's not a true low or a true drop that's taking place.
Yeah, and you get pretty good at spotting it after it's happened a couple of times.
That's right.
It's wild.
But, looking at sensor data it's an art and a science, and I'd encourage anybody who's using a CGM to work with a good clinician who's able to not only interpret the data effectively, but teach you how to do it, what types of patterns to look for and how to make appropriate adjustments based on those conclusions that are drawn. Before
I let you go, right before we started talking, I was looking up some articles that you've written, and I found one from 2007 when you were giving terrific advice about using CGM. And right, you laugh because it seems like it's such a different world. Looking back, it is pretty amazing how far we have come and where things are going. Can you share your perspective on that as someone who uses these and has lived with diabetes?
So the first CGM I wore was in 2003, and that was a mini-med system called the mini-med CGMs, and it was nothing more than a black box with a wire coming out of it that attached to your skin, and it had a very large sensor that went into the skin. Now, that thing was cumbersome, clunky. It didn't even give you data while you wore it. But it was really cool being able to download it and see what the glucose levels looked like all day and night. It wasn't terribly accurate, but at least seeing what the patterns were like was just fascinating. Now, not only can we see our data live, we can learn cause and effect relationships as they happen. We can trust these things. We can use them as a management tool on a minute-to-minute basis if we want. And like I said, if you're skilled at analyzing the data from them, you can learn so much and fine-tune your program. I wanted to mention, if anybody doesn't have a clinician that really understands these reports all that well, they can reach out to my team because we work with people all over the country and overseas by phone and by internet to analyze these types of things.
And Gary, let me just take that one step further. I was definitely going to link up, Integrated Diabetes Services. Do you work with people of all ages?
Yes.
Kids, adults, seniors?
Yes.
It's really important because not everybody does. So I just wanted to clarify that. And then let me also ask you to continue the thought about the accuracy of the CGMs, because of course the next step is the pumps and the closed systems that are going to be using that data. We really are almost there. I mean, it's incredible when you talk about wearing that CGM 15 years ago, 16 years ago. We're really on the precipice of multiple systems. I assume you're excited and think they're going to be accurate. I hope.
Yeah, very excited. Personally, I am running this do-it-yourself loop app that takes, an old pump along with a new Dexcom G6 and runs it through an app on my phone, and the app controls my pump's insulin delivery. It's got its share of little technical glitches now and then, but overall, it helps me achieve the best control that I've had in 30 years.
Wow.
And it does it just by compensating for my own inequities. When I make mistakes on things or underdose, overdose, etc., it fixes it for me. Not immediately. It takes a little time, but it does compensates for things that I don't get exactly right. So it's like having another brain watching over things for me and helping take care.
That's fantastic. Gosh. Well, I can't wait. It's a lot of great stuff that's coming. It's a lot of great information here. Gary, thank you so much for spending so much time with us. Again, all the information about Gary and his amazing team will be at diabetes-connections.com if you want to contact them for a consult or more information. And of course, the book, Think Like A Pancreas, new edition coming out later this year. Maybe we'll come back on and talk to you more about that, or at the very least, give the information to my listeners. But Gary, thank you so much.
Stacey, it was my pleasure.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Of course, I will link up more information, some basic stuff about CGM and the different types that we talked about, all at diabetes-connections.com in the show notes, that sort of thing, as you are well familiar with if you listen every week. I'm also going to list some more information about Gary and his books. You can really find everything at his home base at Integrative Diabetes Services. I'll link that up too. And as he said, that is a service, that is a group that is available to you wherever you live. So if you're not satisfied with your local endocrinologist, or maybe you don't have a local one, there's a lot of places that you have to see your general practitioner or another doctor. They can help. I really like these extra episodes that I've been working on. I'm learning so much from them. If you have a suggestion, if there's a topic you'd like to hear more about, or if you think these episodes are too long and you'd like to hear less, please let me know. The best place for feedback, I think, is the Facebook group, Diabetes Connections, the group. But you can always email me, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com. I really like to hear from you. The show is here to help the community. So if you've got a suggestion, please let me know. Thank you, as always, to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. And thank you so much for listening to the show and coming back every week. We have great stuff on tap for June. June is always a big month because the American Diabetes Association has their annual convention, their scientific sessions. So a lot of news and studies are released. I can't pretend that we will keep up with all of them here on the podcast, but we will do our best to hit some of the high spots and post a lot more on social media as well, so you can keep up that way. But I can tell you that in June, we will be talking about dads and diabetes. A couple of great guys I wanted to talk about specifically for Father's Day. We're going to have Maura McCarthy, of course, back on for Dear D-Mom, where we answer your questions and give advice, and so much more. Thank you so much for joining me for this bonus episode, and I will see you back here next week.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.